of our sessions on operationalizing various aspects of the system of care approach, which is a need that was expressed by many of you. And today's session will focus on operationalizing leadership in systems of care. We like these sessions to be as interactive as possible, so we encourage you to put your questions, comments, or insights in the chat box throughout the session. We will probably be able to open up the lines during the question and answer period so that you will also be able to ask your questions verbally as well. And we have incorporated time for this. Denise and I will make sure that any questions you enter in the chat box will be addressed. Just below the chat box, you will see a box that will allow you to download today's PowerPoint and other resources. And as a follow-up, you'll receive a link to the recording of the webinar. Also, at the end of the session, a link will pop up for a very brief evaluation survey, and we would really appreciate that you take a few moments before logging out to complete that and provide us with your feedback. We really do take it seriously, and we try to use it to improve our future learning community sessions, so we would certainly be very appreciative if you could do that for us. I'd also like to take a moment to mention our new learning management system, which is called Ideas at the Institute. This is a platform that will allow our learning communities to be more interactive and more user-friendly. And it serves as a digital hub. And you can join the various learning communities that we offer through that platform. You can register for webinars. You can find recordings of previous webinars and resources related to those. And you can also interact with experts and your peers, among other features that it offers. The link to sign up for that is on this slide. You can use your email as your username and then click on password change me. You won't be able to use the system until you do change your password. So we encourage you and your staff and partners to sign up to be able to take advantage of that system. I think it offers you a lot of opportunities. I also wanted to mention that our next learning community is May 17th, also at 2:30 Eastern Time, and the focus of that one will be on evaluation and quality improvement strategies for systems of care. You all know that it's a critical function for systems of care and important both for demonstrating positive outcomes, but also for making the case for investing in system of care expansion. So we hope you'll put this on your calendar and join us then. And our wonderful tech expert, Tiara, will put a link to register for that in the chat box. And as always, you will see that information in the TA Telegram, and it will be provided in the follow-up email that you receive after this webinar. I'd like to highlight just one more option. The TA Network is offering a great opportunity for you to participate in the Frameworks Academy, which helps to reframe communication and messaging for the biggest impact. We had a kickoff webinar last month through our learning community. You may have participated in that. And there are 2 more upcoming webinars about framing messaging through our social marketing hub. And I encourage you to check the TA Telegram for information for those and registration. There will be a subscription for Frameworks participation, and it'll be 1 per state but with multiple users. Many of you received an email probably about this. It went to state children's mental health directors and project directors and other leads from SAMHSA grants like System of Care, Healthy Transitions, Clinical High Risk, and others. And it will work by allowing key leadership in your states to identify a few themes that you think could fundamentally change mental health care for children and youth in your state. And then you would need to respond to the email, identify the partners that would participate and the theme you propose to address. And the TA network will provide a subscription for your state, but multiple users can employ this. And the best news about that yet is that it is totally free to you and your colleagues in your state. So, again, today's topic will focus on leadership. We are very fortunate to have two outstanding presenters today. Ellen Kagan is a Senior Policy Associate at the Georgetown University Center for Child and Human Development and is the Director of the Georgetown University Leadership Academy. Over the years, that academy has trained countless system of care leaders throughout the country. And we are also pleased to have Alex Greenland join Ellen. He's a family member and the Director of Product Development at Coach Approach Partners. And he wanted us to know that he's happy to be here today to participate. So I'd like to thank them in advance for their great work in putting this session together. The objectives for today's session are to define and contrast leadership and authority, talk about leadership styles, the complexity of daily work, looking through a lens of neurobiology, and define strategic alliances, identify key challenges of responding to complexity, making the case for adaptive leadership. A very interesting part of this is on defining the coach approach, looking at the mindsets and skills that are involved in that, and also reflecting on yourselves and your experience using coach approach skills and learning how that can be applied in your own settings. And also to connect the coach approach to concepts like adaptive leadership and leadership styles. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ellen, who will get us started. Ellen?
Great. Yes. Thank you, Beth, and thank you to Denise and Tiara for orienting Alex and I. I want to say welcome to all the participants. Many of the names I'm familiar with. Others of you are new to me. And wanted to introduce this topic of leadership. Also wanted to say how pleased I am that Alex is joining the System of Care conversation for the first time. Alex and I have been working together on this concept of the coach approach to adaptive leadership and have had the opportunity to share that with many states around the country. So for those of you who are engaged in leading systems of care, you know that you are in the process of actually leading change of mindsets, of paradigms, which is going to require behavior change and skill set change in so many different levels that you're working in. Many years ago, when the system of care concept was introduced to the field of children's mental health, one of the areas that I focused on was the area of strategy. And like many of you on the call, had been involved in strategic planning, and I was at Georgetown with Beth at that time, working with states and communities on developing those strategic plans. And while I felt as though the strategic plans were sound and very, very credible and very connected to the work that we were doing, what I found was, and many of you will resonate with this, is that our good plans often sat on the shelves for far too long, or many of the concepts were not being operationalized. And began to, at that time, wonder what else could the system of care world be thinking about in order to help create this process for change. And the field of leadership, a very new field, relatively speaking. I mean, you couldn't get a PhD in leadership before the late 1990s or even the 2000s, began to give us some answers around some evidence-based practices that leaders were using around the world that can help us mobilize others for change. So what Alex and I want to talk about today is this idea that leadership is actually a function in systems change, and it's a function we want to put a spotlight on today, and asking that all of us consider how we do our work in a very intentional way that brings in leadership and coach approach skills so that we can show up in our day-to-day work in a way that changes the conversations that we have with the diversities in our communities to move the system of care forward. So leadership and leadership development, and Shara, we can advance the slide. Has really seen an explosion over the last 15 to 20 years. And the big question that leaders ask ourselves is, how do we show up and turn these dreams of these paradigm shifts from silos to more integrated approach, from working as professionals and families, again, being siloed, and working together, peer support, peer partners, the world of evidence-based practices and data-driven processes. How do we turn those visions into reality? Now, the challenge with leadership is that people that we're working with aren't always with us. The complex nature of individuals really makes it sometimes a moment in time where the diverse perspectives are not aligned. And the ever-changing world around us makes it also impossible for us to know in our own minds how to have all the answers. That the answers to how do we mobilize others come from many, many different places. And we are going to be doing a lot of shifting from telling people what to do to beginning to use more questions and asking people how to make these changes around us. Advance the slide. So we want to postulate, first of all, is that leadership is inside of each of us, that it doesn't have to come from above. Next. It can come from any chair, and this is a theme that in the Leadership Academy we talk about all the time, to feel this sense of internal power, to be able to use your voice, to use your emotions, to use your physical presence, and to use the internally spiritual side of us, the soulful side of us, to really present what it is that we want to have happen. So it can come from any chair, and it's embedded inside of each of us. Next. So in this case, leadership is a verb. It's a function. It's about action. It's defined by what we do, and it's not about a role or a position that we hold. The idea here is that we often look up for leadership based on this idea that we are all working within hierarchies, and we all have titles. But in this case, we're calling leadership a set of actions, a set of skills, a set of mindsets, and a set of attitudes versus a position and defined by your role. Next. The challenge here is that when we go out with trying to create change, the system often resists that change, and the system pushes back on us, and we feel like this is a very heavy load to bear. Well, Peter Senge, next, said in his book, The Fifth Discipline, that the changes, all the changes that we see out there that we want to have happen, the changes required won't only be in our organization, but they're going to be in ourselves, so that the way in which we often go out into the world to try to change things may or may not have the impact on the system that we're looking for. So Peter Senge suggests that we'll have to reflect internally about how we think, And only by doing that can we change policies and practices writ large in our communities, and only by changing how we interact with each other can new capacities be established. So we have to think of ourselves first to change. The change, however, and next, is that as we push that boulder up the hill, there's also personal resistance to change. Next. So who wants change? Everybody wants change, but when you ask the question, who wants to change, everybody's hand goes down. And so we think about, if we're asking people to alter their status quo, we think about this framework, which Alex and I will be using throughout the rest of the time together. Most of us operate within something that we call our comfort zone. And when we're in our comfort zone, we're behaving in a natural kind of way. And when we're behaving in a natural kind of way, a comfortable kind of way, there's little opportunity to grow or learn. Then there is this other zone that we have experienced that is called our panic zone. And when you're in your panic zone, it's so stressful to think about changing our behavior or doing something that feels so outside of what is typical for us. We are more likely to shut down than learn or grow. This happens, and Alex will describe this in a few minutes, because of what's called our amygdala hijack. So the most important zone is the stretch zone, where we have this opportunity to learn and grow. So what we're looking for is the stretch zone. And in that stretch zone, we're going to be providing leadership in the following definition for the rest of our time together. Leadership, instead of being a role or position, is actually a process. And it's a process that we actually begin by envisioning and initiating something that will mobilize others to alter what is the current status quo in your communities, your agencies, your organizations, your states, in response to an urgent challenge or an exciting opportunity. Now, this process also requires a behavior that embraces relationships. And I often say, if you don't like people, you should not be in the leadership business. And even people that you don't really like. And it may be that these are people who are challenging for you. And someone in one of the leadership academies actually said, in a way, you really have to love people even if you don't like them. It's also behavior that has change as its essential goal. So as we think about these paradigm shifts, we know that paradigm shifts happen because really strong leadership is present. And lastly, leadership is also an awareness. That at every given point, you have a choice point about what we do with our time. In a moment, we can strengthen a relationship, we can bring clarity to a conversation, we can ask a good, open-ended, curious question that gets people thinking, or in that very same moment, we can show frustration, we can blame others, we can shut someone down or not show up, not even be present. And so these three things, the process, the behavior, and the awareness, really leads us to this definition of leadership, which distinguishes itself from authority. And very often people mistake the idea of leadership from authority. We sometimes think it's the same thing, but we also know that there are many people who sit at the top of organizations who may or may not have shown really intentional, positive, mobilizing leadership. The same can be said for people who might be on the front line, who think within their job and don't have the opportunity yet to think about what leadership they could be providing to actually mobilize change. So we want to make this distinction between leadership and authority. Leaders with formal authority, and then for leaders, there is also leadership with informal authority, which may mean you don't have a title that says director or chief or team leader. So we're encouraging everyone to behave leaderly. And this leaderly idea is with a very disciplined, responsive, focused, and intentional approach when you show up at the office or in the field or in the community. But there's also this way of acting humanly, which is more instinctive and natural. It's without thought and can sometimes be reactive. And so we're now going to take a moment to look at our neurobiology and say, what happens in our brains that can help us act leaderly, and what is operating that is causing us to act humanly? Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'm hopeful that a lot of that was review, because we're going to get into some sort of big picture things a little bit later, and it might seem like a little bit of a departure, but my job hopefully is to take things back and make it all relevant and make it make sense. So 60 seconds of neurobiology. I hope this doesn't intimidate anybody, so we're only going to do it for very quickly. But the headline is that our frontal lobe, the part of our brain that does reasoning, planning, movement, and I can sort of draw it here if the thing's not clear, but just that front area, that's involved in purposeful acts such as creativity, judgment, problem solving, planning. So that's in our brains where that comes from. The amygdala, and as you've heard from Ellen, what people can refer to as an amygdala hijack, is controlling emotions such as regulating when you're happy, when you're mad, when you're threatened, when you're feeling joy, when you're hungry, you have something to eat, or you're starving. All those feelings come from the amygdala. And because the amygdala is closer to our brainstem down here, it works faster. So I'm sure there have been times in our lives when something happens to us and we sort of react, and there may have been opportunities to sort of take a breath and relax, and maybe we would have done something differently if we'd given ourselves that much time. It's because we're responding to that first reaction of our brain from the amygdala rather than waiting for our prefrontal cortex and our rational brain, as it's called, to sort of make sense of our situation. So the headline is that we react biologically. It's not necessarily a fault of anybody's. It's just how we're hardwired. And here are the biggest threats that we respond to. So this is the SCARF model. This is from David Rock, pretty recent, around 2002, I think, somewhere around there. And it talks about these ideas of status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness as all triggers to our, to our brains, as if these things are at risk, if we feel at risk to our status or at risk to our certainty, autonomy, relatedness, or fairness, that our brain interprets that information as if we're under attack, even like the same way that we would be under physical threat. And same with reward. So what's, especially interesting about this is that it connects our biology with how we respond to things, but also with our interpretation. Because to some people, fairness can look very different, right? So to some people, for example, in the world, capitalism is fair, and to other people, socialism is fair. So it can get very messy when you try to take care of people's status and certainty and autonomy related to fairness without having a conversation with them first. So I guess this is a time for a poll question. So when we talk about the SCARF, so your status, and we're going to define status as how you're imagining people see you or value you in the world, whether that's by how much money you make or your position or sort of how much influence you have, maybe in your neighborhood and in your house. Certainty as how confident you are in future events. Autonomy, how in control you feel about where you can take your life. Relatedness is how you relate to other people. And then fairness is just about if you feel like you're being treated equally to the people around you. So which one can you sort of recognize in yourself as, oh, yeah, I know that if things are really uncertain, that really hits me hard. Or if things aren't fair, that really hits me hard. So go ahead and take a couple of minutes here. Think about which one affects you. And we'll end the poll and move on from there. And as you're filling this out, I will share that there is definitely some overlap into some of these elements. Again, no right or wrong answers, and it's all about how we interpret things. But
Alex, if I can jump in here,
sure,
how many of you have ever said, "Oh, my boss is such a micromanager"? Mm-hmm. If you've ever sort of had that kind of thought in your head, that would be most likely related to either autonomy or to status. Mm-hmm. And also thinking about certainty, how many of us have been coming up at the end of our grant period and we don't know if we'll have a job, within 6 months, or the people around us having the opportunity to have long-term vision for their job security would also be in the domain of certainty.
Sure. And you may have a preferred element of SCARF at work and another preferred element of SCARF at home. You may want things to be a certain way at work and the things to be, have a different top priority somewhere else. So that's all natural. That's fine. Okay, so I think we're ready to move on here. Got a lot of answers around relatedness and fairness, so that, I think, probably makes sense for this audience. And, okay, so now to make things even more difficult for us, we're operating in what we're calling a VUCA environment. So VUCA is a concept from the armed forces, and it's about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. This is the life that we live in. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Even if we got the smartest people in a room together and they had infinite amount of time, you never know really what tomorrow can bring. And some things that may seem like they're simple are often not. Tomorrow's never guaranteed. You never can guarantee how someone's going to react or take news, and you don't know how that news is going to come necessarily. So our role as leaders, and hopefully this is starting to make the case for adaptive leadership, is to help people thrive in an environment that's naturally geared toward volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, even though, as we just saw earlier, that our minds are wired and connected heavily to things like certainty and relatedness and fairness. So how can we hope to do that? Well, before we get there, there's even one more sort of barrier in our way. And this is a Chris Argyris model, and it's called the ladder of inference. So the headline of this model is that the world is so big that we can't take in all the information available. If you have pens at your desk, I'm sure you haven't counted exactly how many pens you have. And the reason for that is because you've made the decision to not think of that as valuable information. We do this all the time. It's a natural part of how we go through the world. Otherwise, we would just be taking in as much information as we possibly could. We wouldn't go anywhere or do anything. So we filter that information based on our culture, our experience, our perspective. What is important, what may not be important, and then what can we extrapolate from the little bit of data that we take. So our brains fill in the gap with the data that you have by adding meaning, adding assumptions, and adding conclusions based on the limiting data. So as a result, we find ourselves in a position where we make choices based on bad information that we've given ourselves. So this is a classic one. It wasn't so long ago that I was dating, and this would happen to me a lot. He didn't text me back. That must mean that he doesn't care about me. So it's over. We're through. Or another way could be that email was really short. It must be that he's not making time for me. So it must mean that they're not happy with my work. So the only data that we have is that the email was very short, but we fill in all these meanings and assumptions around that, and then that can create more uncertainty, more volatility, can affect our status. So it will naturally happen that we create these stories for ourselves, and this can often get us into trouble. So all of these things, the ladder of inference, the VUCA, the SCARF model, all makes the case for adaptive work. So in adaptive work, we have to admit to ourselves that perspectives emerge, and we do not and cannot have all of the information, just because there's so much out there, and the world is so complex, and we fill in gaps that aren't there, that it's impossible to know everything. In addition, that the definition of the problem is unclear. And even if you think you're solving a problem, who's to say that it's the right problem in the first place? So the solution and implementation is unclear. It requires constant learning. So the primary focus of responsibility for making the change is not necessarily with an authorized leader. It's with the people who need leaders to help them adapt by adapting themselves. As Ellen's talked about earlier, leadership comes from any chair. So making change cannot happen from just one perspective. Nobody is omniscient. Everyone has gaps. Everyone might fill in gaps with bad information. So it's essential that we emphasize partnerships with other people, that we emphasize leadership from other people, and that we share this responsibility of leadership and making change happen with others. So I'll say a little bit about this and then transition back over to Ellen. So leading with intention. So the intention that we're setting is the intention of opening ourselves to leadership with others, leadership as partnership, leadership that shares and opens ourselves up to other perspectives because of the nature of the world being so volatile and uncertain, and because when we get information, sometimes we fill in the gaps. It is essential to work with other people. And the intention is not just to show up wanting to make change happen, but the intention of creating change with others and establishing a partnership that lasts and built on trust. So I'm going to throw it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Alex. The intentionality that we're going to focus on for the remainder of our time together really also comes from a conversation I had with Beth. So I want to give a shout out to Beth. And as we were discussing topics around intentionality, I threw out 3 or 4 ideas to her, and she said, great, do all of them. So this is going to be a very high-level introduction to the topics of leadership styles, to the concept of strategic alliances, and then finally the topic of building this very safe and trusting environment with our colleagues and with our communities using the coach approach. So I'm going to start off with the topic of leadership styles, which is a vast topic. And so for the purpose of this webinar and for the purpose of learning, I chose 5 from the literature that many of you will recognize and many of you have used in your leading change in systems of care. So I'd like to just briefly share with you these styles, and we can begin to sort of explore them and how we use them in our ability to lead change over time. So the first style is called directive. It's often affiliated with things like commanding or controlling, and we certainly can use our authority based on our job description to use this directive approach. I think all of us are familiar with it because we, especially in large agencies, get directives all the time, and that would be the directive style. The second style we pulled is called motivational, and in this motivational style, it's actually a close cousin, believe it or not, to the directive style, but it uses more of a inspiring, uplifting, cheerleading approach that provides reasons for the actions, compelling reasons. And I'm sure when you're talking about communication, when you're talking about social marketing, we're using the motivational style a lot. And in a way, though, we're still kind of telling people what it is that we want to have happen. And often, if it's in our control, we have an opportunity to provide some incentives for those changes. Incentives including, like in the corporate sector, financial benefits and or thinking about what Alex presented about SCARF, using the SCARF model as a way to build in incentives so that people's status, certainty, autonomy, fairness, and relatedness are all bolstered. The third area is called participatory, and we certainly use the participatory in system of care development, and this ensures that there's inclusion of a broad range of people from a variety of agencies. We're providing this kind of very encouraging, safe space for sharing, and as Alex mentioned, this partnering. Usually participatory is exemplified by a sense of equality. And we'll also often bring in an outside facilitator to help us with participatory styles so that we can make sure that everyone actually does feel that sense of equality and safety. The fourth area is educational. And this is when individuals bring in expertise that enhances the knowledge base or creates opportunities to go out and do surveys or focus groups or listening sessions so that we bring back to our tables, our collaborative tables, for example, the opportunity to facilitate learning by bringing in knowledge and expertise that is out there and accessible to us. Certainly technical assistance centers like the Institute would be using a very strong educational style in bringing to the field experts and facilitating the learning through webinars and trainings and academies, etc. The last is called creative. And this is the ability for leaders to kind of really open up the scope here and be really imaginative and original and really create a space to generate new ways of thinking. So instead of us telling people what to do or even encouraging people what to do, we're actually saying we want you to discover and create new solutions because those solutions have not existed here before. So these are the five styles that are in the five styles selected for this purpose in the literature. I want to sort of see if in the public chat there are any questions about those styles, just to make sure I've been clear. You know, I'll invite people to put into the public chat any clarifying questions between two of them because we're about to go to a poll. Because everyone has a preferred style. And every one of us comes to this work with history and background that makes one of these styles more visible and present in our work in creating change. So I wanted to open a poll to see what are the preferred styles. And I'm going to ask you to pick one for the purpose of this poll, even though we may be dancing between two, and see what people are saying. All right, so we've got lots of people in participatory, no one in directive or educational, and I'm going to ask everyone to sort of pick one. I know some of you are on the phone, so this will be a little more difficult. And if you're not responding, partially because of technical reasons, but partially because you never thought about this before, it's very common for leaders not to necessarily be even aware of what our style is or is not. So anybody else want to join in? Try to be as reflective as you can. Ah, one directive. Good for you. Anybody out there in the educational domain? All right, so we can close the poll just so that we can see what we have here. So participatory is very heavily weighted. 10 of you said that, more than 50% of you said that that was your preferred style. A handful around motivational, and just a couple in creative and one in directive, and nobody in educational. So I want to just throw out an interesting sort of thought here, and we can go to the second poll as well. And that is, in order to create change, we actually need to have all of these styles present. All of these styles present. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to have all of them, and we'll talk about how we partner with people in a moment. But the next poll is asking you to reflect on which of these leadership styles have you personally used in your work to advance systems of care. So I open that poll and see what we get. Okay, we have lots of people logging in.
Ellen, do you want just one vote here too?
No, it can be multiples. Yeah, thank you, Denise. Yeah, so which of these leadership styles have you used? And to be really thinking about your own abilities and stretching, if we're gonna stretch into multiple styles. And we'll just see which ones you've used in the past. So we should have at least as many in participatory as we had in the first poll, because those are, I'm assuming if it's a preferred style, it's something you've used. And I can see what's interesting about this poll. Tiara, can people see the two different polls? Oh, it only lets you identify one. I see. Okay. So if the poll only lets you do one, then pick the one you've used the most. How about that? All right. So as I'm looking at this, for those of you who can't see it, what's interesting about the poll is that it's much more diverse across the multiple styles, which kind of lets me know that not everyone always has the opportunity to use our preferred style the most, meaning we're not leaning on it as heavily, and that we also are recognizing that we have to have a variety of these styles in order to advance systems of care. You know, as an example, I want to share something with you that was a personal experience of mine. I was working in my community to advance the concept of leadership opportunities for teenagers in my community. And because of my activism, and I happen to have a very participatory style, it's probably my preferred style as well. I also knew that a style that I can kind of get sometimes uncomfortable using is directive. And so in order to facilitate my ability to advance this agenda that I had been wanting to create some change around, I actually invited a business person who happened to be a businessman in our community to be my co-chair, my partner, so that when we needed to do something that felt a little more directive, I had a partner whose skill in this case was to advance a more directive style. So it means that how do we make sure, this is a question for all of us, how do we make sure that we have all the skills, all the styles at our ready? So we can go to the next slide, because it's two scenarios really quickly where we want to think about which style would you use. So I'm suggesting that we stretch into other styles which may or may not be our preferred, and or partner with others. So this is your style. Which style would you use? Your organization just received a large grant to increase post-high school options to transition age youth in your system of care. What leadership style could the leader use to create a shared vision to change the status quo of opportunities currently in the community? So if you are creating a shared vision around increasing options for transition age youth and move and advance the status quo of opportunities, which one would you use? Right. All right. So you know what, Tiara, if we can open the line for just a second, let's get a little bit of interaction here, and ask the question for the person or persons who said educational. Why educational? What would be your rationale to use educational? So Tiara, is it possible to unmute the lines?
In the interest of time, Ellen, I think it's better if we wait and unmute the lines at the end during the Q&A. That way you'll have a chance to get through the content and leave enough time, a few minutes for that.
Perfect. Okay, great. So we see, let's all remember these answers and responses, and sounds good. Let's go to the second poll. Some members of the state collaborative in your state are unaware of the extent of disparities in services and supports. What leadership style would you use to address this challenge? Great. Yeah. So if people are unaware of things, we really have to bring in an educational approach and an educational style. Okay, 100% of the people said the educational style. Poll is closed. All right, let's go to the next. So we saw it in both a word cloud and we saw it in the polling form. So I just wanted to share with you this quote from Daniel Goleman, who wrote Leadership That Gets Results, and he's also the sort of founder of emotional intelligence. The quote is, "The best leaders don't know just one style of leadership. They're skilled at several and have the flexibility to switch between styles as circumstances dictate." So I hope you leave this conversation with the awareness that you have a preferred style. You probably have a strongest style that is innate and very comfortable for you, and to identify the leadership styles that are challenging, and to begin being discerning and reflective on which leadership styles do you want to take on next in your leadership growth and development process. And to also always remember you have the opportunity to partner with others. So the leadership styles, I leave you with that thought. And then the second area that we want to talk about being intentional around very briefly is developing strategic relationships. And in this case, we're talking about strategic relationships because as Alex shared, in adaptive work, we have to use the collective intelligence of everyone at all levels who are resources to us to help us create these new solutions. And strategic alliances help us because they allow us to see the perspectives of others. And this, we're going to talk in a few minutes about trust and safety so that we're actually able to hear the perspectives of others. And we as leaders will never see the whole picture. The humility we need to have requires us to have this team learning. We also have to remember that our ladder of inference is causing us to miss opportunities. And building relationships to accomplish these goals will help us build our capacity to lead change. This quote by Alice Wong, who is the founder and project coordinator of Disability Visibility Project, says that all researchers, policymakers, and activists have a role to play in creating social change and expanding opportunity for people with disabilities. But the lived experience of people with disabilities must be at the center of that process. And so Alice is reminding us that we need to make sure that the people who are the beneficiaries of our services and supports have a very central voice at that table. The next slide really outlines on the left-hand side the types of relationships you will have. This could be a webinar unto itself to really outline the types of relationships, but they will go from allies and confidants all the way down to the resistors and the opposers, and to make sure that we have those voices at the table as well. And the big message we want to leave you with here is we need to build relationships before we need them. Very often we believe that by having one conversation or a signature on a grant ensures collaboration, and we know that we have an opportunity to build these relationships long before we need that signature on a page. So these are reflection questions relating to a relationship map, which is another exercise to determine who is in your sphere of influence and who's missing. What relationships do you have that will further the goals? Who's missing, and what should you do next? And when we do this relationship map at the Leadership Academy, people walk away with clearly identifying that there are people who we assume might be in relationship with us, but in order to help co-lead change and to be creative in designing new solutions, we need much more interaction and engagement with them. So these are the skills that we need to have effective alliances. And you can see they're very strongly related to our building relationships, of course, presence, listening, partnership, authenticity, discipline, focus, and awareness. We'll be seeing how we need the same skills across many different domains. And the question or the challenge is for us, if we really want to live intentionally, and we want to live in a way that creates change and influences others, how on earth do we create and sustain this with so much going on that we can't see or control? So we know that the people are biologically wired, and we know that the world is VUCA, but fear not, because there is adaptive leadership ahead of us. And adaptive leadership is the kind of leadership we provide when there are these legitimate competing perspectives. And the big question I want to offer to all of you is, does making progress on this problem require changes in people's values, attitudes, and or habits of behavior? And in systems of care, the answer to that is most likely yes. So this is just a quick little overview of the process of what is adaptive leadership. It requires us to do assessments about what's going on in our world by getting on the balcony, identifying what's the adaptive challenge, by diagnosing what do we need to learn or what could we try. Sort of this process monitoring about regulating the kind of distress that people are feeling in a safe environment, and what do we need to watch out for, and how do we increase the safety of others, and then making sure that we stay focused and following through in providing accountability. And then, of course, there's always the reflection about how did it work once we went out there and tried something. Was it what we thought? And that reflection causes us to do a whole nother assessment. So here's a list of, again, leading from any chair and the qualities of adaptive leadership. And you can see that they're very similar to the kind of qualities, flexibility, presence, listening, accountability, feedback, discipline, and focus. And we're going to ask you at a later time to think of other skills that you have that you use, because each of those are going to help us with our one-on-one relationships in using what we call a coach approach to adaptive leadership. Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. Sorry, I was muted there for a second. I'm just going to look at the clock and say that there's about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go through this a little bit fast. So I want to set that expectation, but also share with you that there's going to be time for questions at the end, so I anticipate questions. So just bear with us as we go through it, and hopefully we get through the content, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So the coach approach is the actionable methodology, how to operationalize adaptive leadership. It's the how of giving people work to change back to people. Again, as I said before, it centers around this idea of partnering with a person, giving them opportunities to author and change their, make their own changes and be co-responsible for the changes that need to happen. You can trust that they're going to make the decisions with good intentions, and you'll provide framework for the safe space for their development and growth. You can make impactful changes while taking care of their scarf, even in a VUCA environment. We're going to talk about how to do that. So what is the coach approach? It's partnering with a person to give them opportunities to be the partner and owner of their changes. It's trusting that they can make good decisions with good intentions without your oversight. allowing people to make mistakes and learn from them to encourage their development, communicating clearly so that there aren't surprises, giving feedback as a perspective and being open to the feedback, to the perspectives of others, and holding yourself and others accountable. So again, all key components to having a trusting, healthy relationship and partnership that's going to allow you to make changes together. So in the coach approach mindset, we're present, focused, and listening to understand building status and relatedness. So by giving somebody your full attention, you honor them and you show them that they're worth your time and your attention, and that can really help somebody feel good. Asking questions to build critical thinking skills, helping a person build autonomy, offering mostly positive feedback, building certainty and relatedness, not just offering feedback when it's negative, or not allowing for people to go on their day-to-day without them knowing how you feel about them. So offering a lot of positive feedback, catch people doing something right. Again, being open to other perspectives, getting that bouncing of you, and encouraging feedback, building fairness. You have perspectives about me just like I have perspectives about you, and it's worth it to share those with each other. Being transparent, you will know where I stand. So cutting through a little bit of that uncertainty, helping somebody feel confident that even if things aren't so good, that you'll know where you stand with somebody else. Okay, so another part of the mindset is that a leader is not an authority, judge, or expert, but they create a partnership where learning and change. We bring and model deep respect for each individual's own learning and development. That means even if it's our boss or even if it's a family member, that they're at their level of learning and development, and it's not our job to necessarily take us to a place that they're not comfortable, but to partner with them. So that's that stretch zone and not that danger zone. So intention is always to strengthen the team member or whoever you're using the coach approach with, and to support their success, right? So it's not about putting them through a process or doing something that you want them to do for you, but it's about creating sort of mutual success. And assuming the person that you're working with has good ideas, and that when we ask powerful questions from curiosity, that these ideas can come out. So the coach approach is an effective in building systems of care because change isn't ever forced or ever done in a way that takes power away from others. So I know a lot of people mentioned that relatedness was a big key component of something that matters to them. So the coach approach really can help with that. It's giving power to people and helping them lead their own change. So outcomes and achievements are reached more quickly, more strategic alliances throughout an organization. People are willing to lead and be led more often, building trust and safety authentically with others. That sounds pretty good to me. Okay, I'm going to slow down a little bit because I've made up a lot of ground. So I don't want you guys to miss some of this stuff, but again, there will be time for questions at the end. What does the coach approach look like? Well, the first thing it looks like is asking more questions and giving less direction. So again, operating in this Luca environment, we wanted to hold our perspectives lightly, still share them because we have a lot of good ideas, of course, but we also understand that there's a lot that we're not seeing. So a really good opportunity to ask more questions. Focus on strength and skill development over time, in addition from day-to-day instruction, interactions, and oversight. So if you have a lot of great ideas and people are coming to you and asking you for help, that's great, but as a consequence, you may be training them inadvertently to come to you every time that they need help. And that gives a lot of more added pressure on your end, can build resentment, can cause a whole lot of problems. So focusing on skill and strength development of others is a great, great asset as part of the coach approach. And then lastly on this slide, we're offering more affirming, grounding assessment and feedback with the intention of strengthening skills, and we're identifying opportunities for improvement from a development perspective. So again, we're using the coach approach, getting people to emerge from your partnership more equipped to tackle the complexities of day-to-day. If you're asking questions that help people build their critical thinking skills, they're going to be able to use those skills and think critically better in similar situations in the future. Okay, so what does it look like? Using a language of commitment and holding people accountable. What can you commit to? Here's what I'm willing to commit to support you. Again, emphasizing that partnership. We're seeking feedback from team members on how we can be more effective in our work with them. Being open to other people's perspectives. You don't have to necessarily take everybody's perspective and adopt it as part of your practice, but it's very likely that they're seeing or experiencing something that you're not or you're not intending, and that can be really valuable information. consciously modeling adaptive, strength-based leadership at all times, so practicing what you preach, and behaving with each other the way that we behave with families, youth, the children we serve, everybody. So just like how we're offering help to others, we're imagining that we're asking for help and support in the same way. So here's a model of the coach approach in just, we'll say 30 seconds instead of 5 minutes. So in this community, people often come with problems and issues that have more than one possible answer. So that's going to probably be many of the issues have more than one right answer. So to just a quick example of the coach approach would be, your first question is, what options do you see in the situation? What are your thoughts about the right way to handle it? What have you tried already? And based on your experience, what do you think the next step should be? So if they come to you with an issue, you can say, well, what options do you think that you have? What are your thoughts about the right way to handle it? What have you tried already? You're going to get a lot more information than if you just give them an example that either A, they've tried before, or B, they're not equipped to do. But also you get a really strong insight into how they problem solve, what resources they have, what they're willing to try without you. And with that information, you're able to make really strong, lasting changes and make change efforts with the most information that you can. So here are the coach approach skills very quickly. At the very top is presence and centering. If you're not giving somebody your full attention, you're not honoring them with your full support, then the rest of this is going to fall apart. The rest is listening, not just listening to wait to speak, but listening to really understand. Clarifying and reflecting to ensure that what you're hearing is what they're intending to share with you. Inquiry and asking good questions, questions that promote critical thinking. Feedback and direct communication, so being able to share your perspective in a way that can be heard, and creating mutual accountability. And again, in the background there, so important to be modeling this behavior all the time, because if you expect this out of others, then if you don't do it yourself, then trust is just gone. So you'll need to always be present. You'll need to be modeling behavior. Offering your time and presence in leading others can be more impactful than just asking questions or offering solutions. I can't tell you how many times it's been that just sitting down with somebody and letting them talk, not necessarily vent, but just to be there with them and to let them know that they're worth it and their feelings are important and the things that they're going through are worth time to honor and give voice to. It's so important, and people can really be empowered by what they come up with on their own. And you'll be surprised and delighted by how much people are willing to do on their own if they're given the chance and the confidence. Okay, so here's a quick coach approach process. So you can do this in an hour setting or even in just 5 minutes, but coming to presence and centering together, clarifying the focus, what do we want to get done out of this conversation? If it's something complex, then maybe you just want to get something done like what's the next step. So that's going into identifying the goal. Then develop an action plan. Again, doesn't need to be a whole strategic plan, but it can just be, what's the next step? Gain commitment. What can you do? Here's what I'm willing to do to support you. And then assess back. So the next time you have this conversation, this is what we talked about. How do we do with that? So here's a directive style, or an example of a directive style to the coach approach. So we're coming up on the end of the year. I have some ideas about what we think our goals are for the next year. I'll share what I think and hear your perspectives. So you're direct in your assessment, your feedback, and your observation, but you're open and curious genuinely about what you might be missing. And you want to make sure that nobody's surprised when things happen or don't happen as a result of a choice made. So you want to share what your goals are. You want to make sure that people know that at the end of the year, this is the situation that we're looking at. But also, with that said, here's how we can open up perspectives and get a broader sense of what's going on or what other people's thoughts are. Here's motivational style. I'm interested in what outcomes you think we might accomplish, and specifically what you would love to see if you could really make strong commitments this year. So not just what people expect, but also what they love. So that's strengths-based feedback, building emotional bank account. You're demonstrating that you're interested in other people's perspectives, and you're motivating others to work toward goals for themselves with your support. So what do other people want to accomplish, and what would they love to accomplish, and how can you as leaders help support them in their efforts that they create for themselves? Here's an example of educational style. What more do we need to know? Where can we find out? Whose expertise do we need? And do we already have the resources available or just not know? So we're providing data so that people can make informed decisions, or we're seeking out data that if we don't have enough if we don't have enough data. And then we're tracking progress with measurable outcomes, being curious about why those things were or weren't met. Participatory style to the coach approach. Again, sorry, I'm going a little bit quick, but I want to leave time for questions. How can I support you? What commitments do you need from me? Here's what I can commit to. So these are all really strong questions that emphasize partnership. It also establishes curiosity on your role in supporting a person through change and what you're willing to change. So you're not just putting somebody through your process, but you're also saying, as part of a partnership, I'm willing to do things differently to ensure your success. You're promoting the ideas of collaboration, collecting ideas and resources from others. And then the last one is the creative style to the coach approach. So what else could you try? What might get in the way, and how could you prepare for that? What else and how else are all great creative style questions for the coach approach. So opening up possibilities and allowing for the exploration of other options beyond just the first present solution. I think so often people say, well, what options do you see? Okay, let's try that. But there's an opportunity really to be more creative and think about what might be beyond just the first answer that comes across, and allowing for problem solving in ways that we could not think to do ourselves alone. Such a great point and such a great reason to involve other people's perspectives. Sometimes people are going to come up with things that we could have never thought of ourselves. Okay, so the who that you are and how you lead adds to the coach approach process. So we're not imagining that anyone is showing up differently, but that your authenticity acts as a model and an invitation for them to be authentic too. Again, that modeling behavior. You're showing up as you, they're showing up as them. How can you make something happen together? Leading into your natural style is always good. There's an opportunity to grow as leaders and develop additional styles, but if you show up in a way that's not yourself, people can sort of sniff that out, and that can create a rift in your partnership. The coach approach is active, but it's also making space for others to control. So dependence on you is not good for people you're leading or their scarf. So this is a way to, again, give power back to the people that you're supporting. Okay, so this will go back to Ellen, and then we're almost done, and we'll open it up to questions.
Right, so on the last slide are really, over the years, some foundational leadership principles that have been reinforced by your colleagues across the country. But I want to just focus on those two that are in bold, and we've covered them on this webinar. It is the principle of your willingness to shift your style when necessary, add to your relationships, and incorporate more of a coach approach to developing answers and creating opportunities in your communities. The coach approach, as Alex outlined, really leans in on questions rather than answers. It focuses more on asking than telling, and your communities and your teams will be better for it. Thank you so much.
So I think we'll open the lines at this point, and you can ask questions verbally, or you can still put your questions in the chat box, and we will propose those for Ellen and Alex to respond to. Denise, it looks like there might be a question that came in. How do you effectively use adaptive leadership when you're dealing with resistance from agency-wide culture and not single leaders and partners? So the issue is agency-wide, a broader resistance.
Great. It's a great question, because I think a lot of people out there would be saying, I'm in a culture where the status quo is pretty profound. And I think both Alex and I would say that the greatest challenge to system of care development is not always one leader, as the question puts out there, but it's from the status quo. You know, that's a very powerful force. It really takes one person to start being what we would call the counterculture, shifting from shifting from telling to asking and being more curious about the future and creating that safe space. We also think that framing the challenge from a values perspective, meaning sometimes the other perspective is also something you support and you can find a way to frame the challenge from common ground. Like, for example, I don't think there's anyone on the phone that would say accountability is not important, but clearly relationships are really important. And so the question might be, how do we balance accountability and maintain a good relationship in the process as a way to frame a challenge from a way of really understanding the other person's point of view. So that would be some of the thoughts I would have about that question. Alex?
Yeah, I think I would agree with everything that you said. The only thing I would add is that it's really nice, and it builds results. It's a way for people to be responsible for themselves if you promote adaptive leadership, and if the people that you're working with also, you give them space to learn to adapt and grow and develop. There's oftentimes people talk about how they have countless calls or emails or people with lines outside their doors because they feel like they're responsible for solving everybody's issues. And with adaptive leadership and the coach approach, we're talking about sharing responsibility so that the people who feel like they're helpless or need permission can now be fulfilled with their status and their autonomy to go make the changes that they know that need to happen. And it opens up the higher level management people to focus on what their types are and address complexity. So I think if you model it, at least in Spears, people are going to take notice and go from that. That being said, especially if there's resistance with leadership, authority/leadership, that's a barrier to overcome. But leadership does come from any chair.
Okay, great. Thanks to both of you for that. There's a question from Sarah about whether you have a book, and I'll add, or other resources that you'd recommend that would help people to implement some of the concepts you've been highlighting.
So, Sarah, we've been thinking about writing, haven't we, Alex?
Yeah, we have. So what I would say to that question as of right now is, yeah, we're working on it. But the reason why we're called the coach approach is because we're trying to use sort of executive coaching level skills and operationalize them so that everyone at all levels, at all ability levels, even children, can be able to use this approach. So the books that I would recommend would be maybe for that high-level coaching, executive coaching, an author named Doug Silsby is a good place to start, and I can put that in the chat. And other books in terms of that would be helpful. As someone who does organization development, it might be best to go by topic, but that's something that you and I can talk offline about which, what you're dealing with and sort of where specifically I might direct you.
That's great.
So
if there's a list of books or resources that you think would be helpful, if you send them to us, we'll be able to disseminate them to the group in the follow-up email to the webinar, which would be great. And Ellen, you mentioned that there's a 2-day training that you're doing all over the country. Can you, and train the trainers too, can you talk a little bit about what that entails and how people might get involved in that if they're interested?
Yeah, great. I'll be happy to do that because we're really invested in teaching this coach approach to as many managers and leaders as we can. We actually are working in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, if there's anyone on the phone from Pennsylvania, to really, and I'm going to use the phrase, change the conversation. Because having watched, and Beth and Denise and those of you on the phone that have been involved in this work a long time, we know that we have to start changing the conversations to be able to open up the opportunities. And 2-day training allows 2 senior trainers to come into your state or community and train up to 40 people at a time on this approach. It's very, very skills-based, and it's based on real plays, not role plays, meaning people bring to the training real issues they're facing, and they walk out of the training with real action steps that they can take to overcome their challenges.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question is the coach approach and some of the other strategies. Are there materials that really apply this to the system of care approach specifically, and what some of the unique challenges might be experienced by systems of care, both when they're trying to be applied statewide and also at the local level?
So I think the main components that really come to me at this moment is we know that the system of care approach is multidisciplinary, multi-agency, and cross-experiences. And so we are dealing with people who have completely different ladders of inference every single conversation that we're having, and we use language that we understand because we're in the field, that many of the people that we're working with see those words in many different ways.
Right.
So while I'm going to suggest that to the field of systems of care, it is even more critical that we develop these skills because of the diversity and the dynamics of complexity that we're working in.
Yeah, and I would add, Ellen, that as adaptive leaders, we want to make sure that if we had a material that it would apply to everyone, and the things are, the nature of the work is so complex that although people are facing similar challenges, maybe across the country, that they are certainly the experts on themselves and their own people and their own organizations and what the unique challenges are for them. So when we do the 2-day trainings, it's very interactive. There's partner conversations. People get into really specific details about the struggles that they're dealing with, and they receive support on those questions through the coach approach to demonstrate that this is a way that it's not just for other people to use and to be used as a giver and not a receiver, but actually it's a great way to receive help as well. So haven't developed materials in terms of handouts or charts or things like that as of yet, but a lot of that gets addressed in our trainings.
Yeah. Can I give an example? I want to give an example that I heard actually from a leader in New Jersey. She was standing at the podium and talking about how to bring the wraparound approach that we have developed for in the children's mental health field to the field of developmental disabilities. And someone in the back of the room raised their hand and said, "You don't know what I'm dealing with." Now, a leader in that moment has a choice point about what they say next. And this particular leader, who had been in adaptive leadership extensively in training, what do you think she said?
Go for it.
Yeah, I would love to hear, like, what would you say next? Because, and how many of us have been in that situation, right? Anybody want to offer a thought?
I hope she said, "You're right."
Yeah.
Well, right. You know, instead of explaining why she actually did understand, trying to show, you know, how she was skilled enough to be able to step into this field, she actually stood back and said, "Exactly, Alex, you're right. There is no way I can know what you are dealing with. We need a different type of conversation."
Yeah. That's great. Thanks to both of you. We are out of time, and I'd like to wrap up and first thank our presenters, Ellen and Alex, for their outstanding work on this learning community session. I think they've left you with a lot of ideas and strategies that you can apply in your states and communities, and I think both are willing to hear from you if you have questions and looking for additional resources. Again, we'd like to ask you to hang in for just a couple minutes longer to use the link that will pop up to complete the survey and evaluation. And I want to thank Tiara Brown from the TA Network for handling all the tech aspects of this session and doing it so well, as she always does. And another plug for next month's learning community on evaluation and quality improvement. The links that I believe were put in the chat box, and you can also find them in the TA Telegram. So thanks to all of you for joining us today, and thanks again to Ellen and Alex.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone. I guess I should also, Beth, put a little plug in. We're doing the 2-day adaptive leadership at the Next Training Institute. So hopefully we'll see some of you there as well.
Right, that'll be in the summer of 2020. So I think, Tiara, you can put up the link at this point. And